right, team, we're back in Exodus chapter 22. Most of you probably, and by most of you I mean 14 of you, probably listen to this podcast to hear me go through scripture and to expand upon it, rather than to hear about my thoughts on politics and culture. So if you skipped the last episode, I don't blame you. So today we're going to be going through more of the Mosaic Law being handed down to the Israelites. And pretty soon here, I'm going to hop off of Exodus and move on. Probably skipping most of Leviticus also. And I've already given you reasons why. So let's begin. Chapter 22, verse 1. When a man steals an ox or a sheep and butchers it or sells it, he must repay 5 cattle for the ox or 4 sheep for the sheep. So this is the principle of restitution, and you're going to find this in a lot of the laws that in the Mosaic Law. That basically, if you do something wrong, you are now commanded to not just say you're sorry, but to make restitution for it, to make up for it. And frequently in our society, we fail to apologize properly for things that we do wrong. So, for example, we'll say, I'm sorry, or, I apologize whenever you've done something wrong, which is part of the apology process. I mean, the first part is recognizing you did something wrong. The second part is actually admitting you did something wrong. But it's the third part that not too many people actually do in our society, and that is asking, how can I make it up to you? Well, the Mosaic Law has that already prescribed in it. And in particular, if you're someone who steals an ox or a sheep and you butcher it or sell it, which means you did so with malicious intent to profit from it or to steal it and consume it yourself, then you got to pay back 5 times that many cattle or 4 times that many sheep. You're ruining someone's livelihood, and you have to make up for that. All right, verse 2. If a thief is caught in the act of breaking in and he's beaten to death, no one is guilty of bloodshed. Now, you're going to see this in a second be more rationalized or quantified. But basically what it's saying is you having, a private residence. We have a castle doctrine in America in some states. Basically, it's saying that your home is your castle and you have the right to defend it. So if someone breaks in and they die, you defend your family or your home from that person and they die, the Mosaic Law is saying you're not guilty of bloodshed. Why? Because it was in defense. It wasn't a murder. It was actually the just taking of life. So, but we're going to see a qualification here in verse 3. It says, but if this happens after sunrise, so it's daytime, there is guilt of bloodshed. A thief must make full restitution. Okay. Presumably, how people will qualify this is that if someone breaks into your house in the middle of the night, you're confused, you're in the fight or flight, and you're going to try to protect your family, protect your things, and you don't know if that person has a gun or a knife or what their intent is. And so the Mosaic Law contrasts that with, well, if it's happening after sunrise, when you have all your wits about you and you can tell what's happening, then you're sort of obligated to meet that attack with a proportional response. So that might be more along the lines of restraining the person that broke into your house rather than beating them to death. So either way, I think scripturally you can say that defending someone else from death, from being murdered, whether it's daylight, whether you got all your wits about you or you're confused in the middle of the night, is a version of killing rather than a version of murder. But I think there's more to that. You could probably do a whole sermon on that and pick that apart. And in fact, I've written an entire essay on it. And doing so, I was very surprised to learn several things that theologians have to say about qualifying even self-defense. So we might get into that another time and dedicate a whole topical podcast to it. All right, a thief must make full restitution. If he's unable, he is to be sold because of his theft. So we had this issue a while back called debtor prisons, where people who owed a debt had to then go to prison. And the problem is, if you're in prison, there's no way you can repay your debt because you can't work. So instead of that, this Mosaic Law is saying, well, that person has to pay restitution. So they have to be able to work to pay restitution. It doesn't say anything about prison. And it also, they're not to be put to death. But it says if he's unable to pay that restitution, then they can be sold off because of their theft. So they can be sold as an indentured servant. And then that money from their labor can then be used to pay the debt back. And I think modern judicial systems probably have the right idea with garnishing wages. I will say, sometimes it does frustrate me. Like, I had a detective literally tell me that judges won't, for example, take a car from someone that has stolen in order to repay you. They won't order the repossession of certain things like that, even though that they owe restitution, because theoretically, if they don't have a car, then they're not going to be able to go to their job to work to pay restitution. So there's a balancing act there. What I think is the important takeaway is the Mosaic Law seems concerned about thieves and criminals actually having some rights. And in that case, it's a merciful law compared to, Islam. I think in the Quran, Surah 4, Surah 5, it literally says that if someone steals, you're supposed to cut their hand off, right? You cut their right hand off if they're a thief. Totally different than what Jews practiced here in the Mosaic Law, and definitely different than what Jesus preaches in the New Testament, where he says, if someone, sues you for your cloak, give them your shirt also. The idea is you're supposed to bless those that persecute you. So, in any case, the Mosaic Law is definitely, it stands out to me among other laws, especially at this time. Okay, if what was stolen, whether ox, donkey, or sheep, is actually found alive in his possession, he must repay double. All right, laws about crop protection. Verse 5. When a man lets a field or vineyard be grazed in and then allows his animals to go and graze in someone else's field, he must repay with the best of his own field or vineyard. So this is actually about negligence, which is again, if you're a lawyer, this is probably really interesting stuff to you, or a judge. But it's basically saying that as a owner of an animal, you're responsible for what that animal does. And if that animal goes and ruins someone else's vineyard or farm, you're responsible for paying that person back with the best of your vineyard or your farm. And as such, it gives you a reason, a very good reason, to not be negligent about what your animals are doing, because there's a steep price you have to pay for what they do wrong to your neighbor. When a fire gets out of control, spreads to thorn bushes, and consumes stacks of cut grain, standing grain, or a field, the one who started the fire must make full restitution for what was burned. I think that there are some kids that started a fire. I have to look this one back up, but a few years ago, there were lots of these large fires. There was one in Gatlinburg, it was really sad, which is a city in Tennessee. And then there was one out west, I believe, that basically they were started by kids. And this one kid I know is going to be paying restitution for that for the rest of their life, basically. So don't be negligent with even things like starting a fire or whatever. And I've heard someone also say this can go to vandalism, arson, vandalism. But you're not allowed to destroy other people's private property, or else you are charged to pay full restitution for that under the Mosaic Law. Verse 7, when a man gives his neighbor money or goods to keep, but they are stolen from that person's house, the thief, if caught, must repay double. If the thief is not caught, the owner of the house must present himself to the judges to determine whether or not he has taken his neighbor's property. This is sort of like to protect against sort of shadiness, like you let someone borrow something, and then, oh no, it went missing. And it's like, well, did it? Like, was there actually a thief, or is this person lying? Then the idea is that you have to determine whether or not the person stole the neighbor's property, or if there was actually a thief. I think what ends up happening is there's a law of innocence until proven guilty in this regard, and you have to take your neighbor's word for it unless you can bring evidence that it was stolen. Whether or not he is... Okay. In any case of wrongdoing involving an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or anything else lost, and someone claims, that's mine, the case between the two parties is to come before the judges. The one that judges condemn must repay double to his neighbor. So that's if someone... There's no, like, finders keepers in this society. And if you found something, you're supposed to give it back. You don't just, like, own it because you found it. And someone can bring a grievance against you. And you pay the same way either way. It's like you stole it. When a man gives his neighbor a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to care for, but it dies, is injured, or is stolen while no one is watching, there must be an oath before the Lord between the two of them to determine whether or not he has taken his neighbor's property. So this is sort of that same situation I was talking about earlier. Its owner must accept the oath, and the other man does not have to make restitution. So basically, if the person who borrowed it gives an oath that, no, like, I did not take this, someone else took this, then you have to accept that testimony because they are innocent unless you can prove that they're guilty, which I think is this next part. But if, in fact, the animal was stolen from his custody, he must make restitution to its owner. So that would be... If you could bring evidence that, hey, actually, under your watch, this thing was stolen and whatever, then your testimony doesn't matter anymore because there's evidence to convict you. Okay, if it was actually torn apart by wild animals, he is to bring it as evidence. He does not have to make restitution for the torn carcass. So in this case, if it wasn't stolen, but it was actually taken by a wild animal, then they can bring the carcass to show that, look, this thing was mauled or whatever. And the other person has to accept that. So that would be like, hey, this was actually like an act of God. And I'm sorry this happens, but like I did not, willingly or maliciously allow your animal to be killed. And the other person has to say, okay, yeah, I totally understand. Like that's just part of life. When a man borrows an animal from his neighbor and is injured or dies while its owner is not there with it, the man must make full restitution. If its owner is there with it, the man does not have to make restitution. If it was rented, the loss is covered by its rental price. Woo! All right. Laws about seduction. When a man seduces a virgin who was not promised in marriage, and he has sexual relations with her, he must certainly pay the bridal price for her to be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must pay an amount in silver equal to the bridal price for virgins. So this law protects young women, because remember, in this society, you were usually under the headship of a man, whether that was your father, sometimes your brothers if your father was dead, but in the end it would be your husband also. And so this is like if a guy were to seduce a young woman and they fornicated, well, he must now pay the bride price and take that woman as his bride, like for the rest of her life, has to take care of her. And the father of the woman, though, can say, no, I think you're a terrible person. Like, I don't want my daughter to be married to you. And you might think, oh, well, I get off scot-free. I don't have to pay the bride price anymore. Wrong. According to the Mosaic Law, you have to pay it in silver, and you don't get your wife. So not only do you pay, but you also don't get your wife. out of the girl who he slept with. So, yeah, interesting stuff. All right, verse 18. You must not allow a sorceress to live. Very straightforward. People who practice occult witchcraft. This also would include people that make, hallucinogenic drugs and potions and things like that use them as a way to access the occult, or mediums that try to talk to demons and things like that. Basically, you weren't supposed to let them live in Israel. There was a capital punishment if you found someone doing that. And later, when we talk about Samuel and Saul, the first king of Israel, you're going to find this actually come up. There's the witch of Endor, and she's basically too afraid to practice witchcraft because she knows it's illegal in the land. All right. Verse 19, whoever has sexual intercourse with an animal must be put to death. So sexual perversions of all sorts in Israel that results in capital punishment, including having sex with animals, bestiality. Number 20, whoever sacrifices to any gods except the Lord alone is to be set apart for destruction. So that would be put to death also. In any case, the law was a prohibition against sacrificing or worshiping other gods in Israel. This is a theocracy. All right, verse 21, you must not exploit a foreign resident or oppress them, since you were foreigners in the land of Egypt. So you need to treat those who are not Israelites who are living among you well. You can't exploit them and you can't oppress them. In America today, we don't do a good job of this. We exploit them through, cheap labor, and sometimes we oppress them, such as the DACA issue. And again, I try to stray from politics where I can, but there are legitimate grievances that immigrants have and have always had in America, including some of my ancestors who were Germans. The Germans originally, when they came here, were oppressed. The Irish were oppressed. Scottish were oppressed. Everyone who was integrated in America has been through some form of exploitation or oppression at a time. And this is something the church should do better at. And actually, I'm not even going to say the church does this bad. Most of the ministries that do take care of even illegal immigrants, they're church-based. You can find at the border between Mexico and America, you're going to find the organizations that try to help these people and give legal services to them to help them through the asylum process and provide for them while they're waiting and all that are usually churches. So in this regard, the church actually does a pretty decent job. And in Israel, you were supposed to do a really good job. All right, verse 22. You must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them, they will no doubt cry to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will burn, and I will kill you with the sword. Then your wives will be widows, and your children fatherless. In other words, God is saying, if you rule unjustly in Israel, I'm going to let another nation rule over you, and they're going to put you to death by the sword. He's going to remove the special grace from the land, protecting them from a foreign invasion. If you lend money to my people, talking about Israel's, to the poor person among you, you must not be like a moneylender to him. You must not charge him interest. So this is usury. Now, usury is considered bad in both Judaism and even more explicitly in Islam. Islam goes further. Typically, Jews and Christians agree that this is different than, say, venture capital. C.S. Lewis talked about how they didn't really envision the stock market. What this is specifically saying is if you're giving someone money because they're poor and they need it, you should not charge them interest. Like if you're going to do a loan or whatever, you should not charge them interest. There's a company called Kiva that does a really good job of doing microloans in third world countries. And other companies do microloans too. They find that the repayment rate's like 98%. It's higher than if you were to loan to Americans here for their businesses. And to my knowledge, Kiva, you don't charge interest on those loans. And that's how it should be, because you are essentially taking advantage of someone in their destitution and profiting off of their destitution. And this is not a Christ-like attitude. My dad always taught me that if I'm going to give someone money, it has to be as a gift. Never give a loan to a friend or a family member. Always write it off instantly whenever you give it to someone. If it gets returned to you, great. But if it doesn't, it was a gift, doesn't matter. And this is in contrast to say, like, you need a loan for your business. I think biblical scholars would mostly agree that that is a different situation. Okay, verse 26. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak as collateral, return it to him before sunset. For it is his only covering. It is the clothing for his body. What will he sleep in? And if he cries out to me, I will listen, because I am compassionate. Respect your God. You must not blaspheme God or curse a leader among your people. You must not hold back offerings from your harvest or your vats. Give me the firstborn of your sons. Do the same with your cattle and your flock. Now, we talked about this. Give me the firstborn of your sons does not mean sacrifice your children. Like that would be evil. There was the redemption price. So you would give money in redemption for that child in thanks to God. It's like an offering to God. Thank you for my firstborn. Okay. And then do the same with your cattle and your flocks. Those you would actually sacrifice. Let them stay with their mother for 7 days, but on the 8th day you are to give them to me. Be my holy people. You must not eat the meat of a mauled animal found in the field. Throw it to the dogs. So this is apparently, it's unclean meat. Talking about something you found mauled in the field by another unclean animal. Like, you're not supposed to eat that. And that's really for your protection. I don't mention germs in here, but the bacteria that comes from that is absurd. So that's not something you want to eat. And God is comparing that practice to holiness or cleanliness. So let's see. That's the end of our chapter. Now, I'm probably at this point going to skip ahead because I don't find a lot of fun in going through each and every one of these laws. And I'm not even sure it does much good. If you want to learn about them specifically, you can pick up a study guide, read them yourself. You can ask me or someone or another Christian and you can go through and find answers as to why, okay, what's with this law? I think the big trap for modern Americans, the issue is people will be like, okay, so like there's a law against mixed fiber clothing. And the theological argument is, well, that's because people were, quote unquote, like watering down garments by using mixed fibers instead of like making them 100% cotton or whatever. It was a regulation on commerce and the quality of the products that you are allowed to produce. But in the same breath, you have things like no bestiality, right? And not that is like popular in America or anything. There's a growing movement in Europe for that. In fact, several years ago, a woman married a dolphin in the UK. But in America, in a lot of the Western world, we're now seeing a prevalence and acceptance of things like homosexual sex. And so people all often say, oh, in Leviticus they were against shellfish. So like, why do you uphold the anti, gay marriage angle at the same time you still eat shellfish? And what I would argue that you need to insulate yourself from is viewing the Old Testament through Old Testament eyes and instead view it through New Testament eyes and find out what the spirit of the law is translated into the New Testament. Find out what it is Jesus fulfilled. So like the sacrificial system, we don't have to do that anymore, right? Because Jesus fulfilled the law and satisfied the righteous requirement for that. So some of these things are great to learn about, right? Like giving the firstborn and all of that. It's good to learn about, but it's not really applicable to the Christian life because of what Jesus has done. Same with the dietary restrictions. Jesus explicitly calls food clean now. But when it comes to things like sexual immorality, well, the Bible uses a word for that. It's porneia. And it covers a gamut of things, including things like bestiality, like homosexuality, things like that are still banned in the New Testament. Why? Jesus will point you back to the ideal of marriage in the Garden of Eden. Paul basically says things like that are a consequence of idolatry in Romans 1. And God gives people over to the sinful desires. He basically says, okay, look, you don't want anything to do with me? Well, here you go. And sin begets sin. And so society grows and grows and grows, and perversion spreads. And I don't just mean that as far as sex, but like perversion of everything in society spreads. So when it comes to the Old Testament law, like read it and you can find lots of interest in it. In fact, Leviticus is like one of my brother's favorite Old Testament books because he finds it so interesting. But put it in its right context through the lens of the New Testament and have the eyes to be able to parse out, okay, this is what Jesus fulfilled. This is why this is no longer applicable. This is still applicable. And all of it, the entire Old Testament, I can learn something from. Even if it's at the very least, I am thankful to Jesus that I don't have to uphold all of this law to get into heaven. Because he did, right? So you can learn from all of it, including what I'm reading in Exodus, Leviticus, and other parts of Scripture. But you need to put it in its proper place. And don't get tripped up when people start, exactly like I was saying before, calling out, oh, you agree with this part of it and not this part. They're not looking at Scripture holistically, and that's what, through this podcast, I hope I can train you or encourage you to do. And I want to start skipping more towards those things. So when we pick back up, we'll probably pick back up in the writings, or something like the book of Joshua, something like that. So until then, this is James from The World's Last Night.